Aloha and welcome to the Bear Woznick Adventure. I'm your adventure guide, Bear Woznick. This is the show you go to. This is the show for all you misfits out there that don't seem to fit in the world, don't seem to fit in the church. You know, it's just kind of a place for all you guys that are just kind of just guys. You know what it reminds me of is the cave of Adullam that King David had when he was running from King Saul. He hid in this cave, and all of the misfits showed up. The guys who, didn't seem to fit in, seemed a little bit contrary, and people that owed money, they all showed up and they hung out with King David, and that became the beginning of his great army. Eventually, that was the core. And so if you're a guy and you're listening to the show, you're driving down the highway in a black pickup truck someplace, you're the guy we want to reach here. We know that if this show is gritty enough for you, then everyone's going to love it. So we always have really great guests on our show. You can see right behind me the man cave sign. The cave, I think of the cave of Adullam. I think of Plato's cave. I think of the ancient caves G.K. Chesterton talked about. I think about the cave Jesus died and was buried in and then rose again from. I think of the cave of the Nativity. So welcome to the man cave. Welcome to the Bear Woznick Adventure. And today I have as my guest, I get to talk to the coolest people because I have a radio show. People who would never want to talk to the likes of me will come on my show. Steve Weidenkopf. I've got two of his books here. I take the covers off because I ruin them while I'm reading them. So I've just read these two books, The Glory of the Crusades and the history, the real story of the Catholic history. Steve, welcome to our show, brother.
Thanks, Bear. Thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
He's too smart for me to talk to, you guys. He's a professor of church history at Christendom College. Did I get it right? In the master's program, graduate.
The graduate school in Alexandria, Virginia.
And if you guys could see him, those of you listening on the radio could see him, there's like walls of books on either side of him. He's basically, what happens if you were in California and there was an earthquake, you'd just be buried in it, I think. So
buried in books. That's not a bad way to go, though.
I know. I love my books. But my challenge is I have this stack of books that I've yet to read, Yeah. And then you store the books that you've read. And the stack of books that I'm going to read just it's a whole shelf now of books I haven't read yet. Is that like you? How many of those books behind you have you actually read? Tell me. There's probably thousands of them there.
Oh, yeah. The vast majority of them that I have read. Or at least used in some way, shape, or form or other. But yeah, just like you, I have an entire stack. It's on my desk here behind the computer, so you can't see it. But I have a whole stack of books that's in the to read queue, so to speak. And there's never enough. There's too many books and not enough time, basically.
I know. Praise God for. And look, check it out. So I have this little thing on the inside of the cover of your book from the Bear Woznick Library, right? And it's got like the date I receive it and then the date read. So I know, okay, this one's done. I can put that on the finished stack. But
nice.
But your two books, especially your new one, The Real Story of Catholic History, it's kind of like debunking the fake news about the Catholic Church, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, that's the whole point of the book is to take some of these common anti-Catholic historical myths that people hear about, either from friends, family members, coworkers, whatnot, or just even watching TV, watching the the so-called History Channel, whatnot. You get these different myths that pop up all the time, and I wanted to give Catholics a tool, a resource that they could use to be able to know that these are myths. First of all, be able to refute them easily.
I mean, it's fake news. I mean, basically, it's and a lot of it came out of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment era, why is it that I love history? It seems like what was it? Cardinal Newman said about knowing history. You want to give me that quote?
Yeah, Newman said that to know history is to cease to be Protestant.
Now, was that Cardinal Newman that said that?
John Henry
Newman. Yeah. To know history is to cease to be Protestant. I just, in my morning catechism today, we read from that big, thick book, but we also read from, I read from them the Didache today, one page from the Didache. To read that and then see the beautiful kind of like growth of that seed into the catechism we have today, it's beautiful. But, the thing is if you know history, it's just interesting how Jesus shows up at the point of the bell curve of the Roman Empire. At the moment when, there was still, when the world was united, that area was united by roads and by basically the Pax Romana. you could deliver the gospel everywhere. You didn't have to go through warring nation states to get the gospel out, Just that whole concept of the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church and all that, it's kind of like there's this common history for a season. So what is it? Why do we love history so much?
Yeah, well, I mean, I love history because it's really it's the narrative of a people. I mean, that's really what history is. History is the telling of a nation or a people's, or in this case, in our case, the church's story. It's really our family history. I mean, when I teach history, that's kind of the first point that I try to make to people, is because a lot of people have this very negative view of history, Bear. I mean, many people think that history is just kind of this boring recitation of names and dates and events, and it has no real meaning in their lives, right?
That's what they made us do in high school. I mean, I'd fall asleep during history class till they got to the Vikings. I like that one.
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, it was so boring. But man, the grittiness of it when you really get down to it.
Right, and it's really how you teach history. I mean, your experience you just mentioned there is probably very common to most people, in terms of how they've learned history, either in high school or college. But if you have a really good teacher, or a teacher who knows what they're doing and loves the subject in particular, and teaches it with a passion, and teaches it as a story, because that's really what this is. When we study church history, we're studying the actions of the men and women who've come before us, our brothers and sisters in the Lord. And that's just like learning our family history, where we come from, where our family came from, when they came to this country, that kind of thing. Knowing that gives us a sense of identity, and having that identity then as Catholics then helps us grow deeper, I believe, in our relationship with the Lord and with his church.
Dude, it's gnarly. Because we can go back 2,000 years and watch our brothers and sisters, the martyrs, the saints. And being in Rome last month, when you walk down in Peter Square and you see the colonnade and the saints, the great cloud of witnesses, and then you look up and you see these gnarly-looking apostles, like, I'm not saying that to be a man you have to look tough and gritty like these guys did. We want a tough and gritty soul. But these guys are looking down and you like, so what took you so long, dude? Let's get to work. Like a real look of determination on they're gritty guys. I mean, I stayed from here. I stayed just a few hundred yards away from where Barnabas, is reposed right now, who I love. That's the icon I have behind me is of Barnabas, the man of son of encouragement, the great evangelist. Those guys walked, they were shipwrecked. They were stoned and not killed. Most of them were martyred. These are tough guys, and we should go back and study their lives and how they lived and the impact that they had, because it's a challenge to us today. We should have even a greater impact from them then, because we have more time on our hands. Frankly, we should be evangelizing.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were just to kind of pick up on that. I mean, they were ordinary men, right? In terms of, I mean, these were not scholars of the law. These were not the, high religious authorities of the day. These were just, average men, right? Men who were working for their families, for themselves or whatnot. And this is who, Jesus came and picked these men, right? These ordinary men who did extraordinary things because of their belief in Christ, their relationship with him, and the grace that he gave to them, especially the outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And they were able to go out and, as you mentioned, like traveling, by walking on boats, they were able to evangelize, the Roman Empire. I mean, the world's greatest superpower, political power, military power at the time. From
England to India to Africa,
Amazing,
Yeah.
And within 400 years of their the beginning of that mission of theirs, that entire government was converted. It's amazing.
They're going from a great persecution. Who was the Eastern emperor again who had that last great horrible persecution, and then boom, Constantine flips it on its head? Who was that emperor?
Yeah, that was Diocletian.
Yeah, Diocletian, the worst. And then Constantine, shows up, and within a I think a few months basically of him being emperor. Going into Rome, the Edict of Milan, right? I mean, making Christianity legal.
Yes.
And you just go through and then you see the fall of the Roman Empire. You see it gradually collapsing in on itself, and the rise of the nations and the different kingdoms. But what was left standing was the Catholic Church. It was Am I right about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, when the Western, at least the Roman Empire in the Western half of the empire fell in the late fifth century, and yeah, what was left there was all power really devolved down to these local regional jurisdictions, which were controlled by Roman military commanders of ethnic German origin, and but they were disparate, right? There was no longer any kind of organized or international, so to speak, institution like there was with the empire, at least again in the West. In the eastern part of the world, the empire continues up into the 15th century when it's destroyed by Islam. But in the West, you have the church, right? It's the Catholic Church is the only institution that kind of steps into that political void and that political vacuum and maintains, sustains, and continues Western civilization.
And develops it.
Right.
I mean, one of the great myths is, the so-called Dark Ages. We're going to take a break here in a couple minutes. Can you debunk that?
Yeah, absolutely. You want me to do that now or after the break?
Yeah, give us your 2-minute version of it, not the whole semester.
Yeah, so the 2-minute version is, the Dark Ages are no such thing. It's a pejorative term. The time period, right before the Middle Ages, right after the fall of Rome or the collapse of Rome in the 5th century, up until about the year 1000, was really a time of great technological innovation, militarily speaking, economically as well in the West. And it's just a pejorative term that previous historians used to kind of fast forward to the Middle Ages and then even fast forward then into the Renaissance, where they thought was the real things that happened.
Well, a lot of historians refer to it in a different way now. How do they refer to that period of time now?
Yeah, most of it is usually referred to as like the early Middle Ages or just the time right before the Middle Ages. So we don't use Dark Ages anymore. At least no self-respecting historian does. It's just it's a again a pejorative term that does not accurately capture.
Who used that? Who developed that pejorative term? How did that come into play? The Enlightenment or
Yeah, it was enlightened authors and and others after them that and so there's different historians try to come up with different time periods and time periods in a certain sense are arbitrary.
Right.
They're just easy ways for us to kind of understand our history.
Right.
But yeah, it really grew out of the Enlightenment, which
it was basically it was anti-Christian, anti-God.
Yes, exactly.
And so it was a pejorative term to try to But the reality is, we're going to take a break here in a minute. The reality is, if it were not for the Catholic Church and the monks, the Irish monks or the other monks copying these great texts, whether it was, the fathers or the Bible or philosophers, whether they were Christian or not, we'd have lost all that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, and so if it weren't for the Catholic Church, I'd have been gone. There's this misnomer that it was the Muslims that carried that forward, but a lot of those great thinkers of the Muslims were actually Jewish people and Christians that were given Muslim names for the work. Hey, we're talking with Steve Weidenkopf. I'm so proud. Am I saying your name right?
You are actually. Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, I'm so proud I can say your name, dude. So
it's that nice, easy Italian name. No, I was kidding.
He's a professor of church history at Christendom College, and I just love William Carroll and his books. The founder, of course, passed on now. We'll be right back with more of the Bear Woznick adventure. Aloha and welcome back to the Bear Woznick Adventure. I'm your adventure guide, Bear Woznick. We have my co-adventure guide today is Steve Weidenkopf. He loves history, so he said, why not make a career out of it? He's the professor of church history at Christendom College in Alexandria, Virginia. And I just love William Carroll. I don't know how anybody could know so much about history. And you read through I don't know, how many volumes is his book, Stephen? Is it like 7, 8, or 9? How many are there?
Yeah. And so, Bear, it's actually Warren Carroll, not William Carroll.
Warren Carroll. Thank you.
You're welcome. But yeah, Warren. So Warren founded the college that I teach at. It's our 40th anniversary this year, and he actually has 6 of these humongously large history of Christendom books, and each one is at least 700 to 800 pages with extensive footnotes and source material. And it took him, obviously, he and his wife Anne both worked on the project. Took him years to finish it, but they're just a treasure trove of
Decades.
information.
I mean, I don't know how I'm an author, and it's writing. Is such hard work.
It is.
Rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And that's so cool. That's cool when it's basically come from inspiration. But when you're having to be historically correct with every little detail and have the source material to back it up, amazing book. I'm reading his books at the same time I'm reading a book called The Primitive Church, and another one on the history and development of church doctrine through history, doctrine and dogma. I kind of read that historical time and then reread it from the other book and reread it from the other book. And it's just mind-blowing. So for you to be a professor of church history at Christendom College makes you kind of like the man, I would say.
Well, thank you. It's a lot of a lot of time, a lot of research, a lot of effort into it. But as I mentioned earlier, and as you pointed out, it's a passion, and I love it a lot. So I'm very, very, very blessed.
You can tell it in your writing. And this book here, too, this recent one, am I going to have to put my glasses on to read it, or are you going to tell us the title?
Yeah, it's the real story of Catholic history.
So it's not the fake news.
It's not fake news. Yeah.
And it's really like an apologetic to some extent. What are some of the real things that really get in your gut when you hear people speaking some of these false myths? Give us a few of the highlights of some. Give us one of them that really stand out to you.
Yeah, well, it's. I mean, just to back up for a minute, the book is. I wrote it and put it into different sections. So the myths in the book, for those who haven't seen it yet, are they're kind of linear. So they start in the early church and go all the way to the modern world, and then I have a section called the mixed bag at the end with just a bunch of different myths that people are usually hear. I mean, for me, I'm a specialist in the Crusades. That's kind of my particular emphasis and focus. As you point out, I wrote a book on that. It was published a couple of years ago. So for me, like the myths about the Crusades really bother me because you see it all the time. It's all in the media. It's in print media as well as on TV and whatnot.
Well, look what Bill Clinton said about it when his speech.
Yeah.
What did he say, and how do you refute this ridiculous statement?
Yeah, his speech, as you referred to, was given a couple of months after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, and he gave it at Georgetown University. And there he said the reason why we were attacked on September 11th is because of the so-called massacre of Jerusalem after the First Crusade in 1099. And so he attributes that crusade or that massacre is kind of the event that's still felt in the Islamic world, and so they're angry about it. So almost 1,000 years later.
But there was this horrible. There was blood up to the bridle, up to the knees, there flowing for 1,600 stadia. It's written. It's a document.
Yeah.
Can you explain what hyperbole means and the reference to Revelations that inferred? And I mean, how could there be blood that thick? How far is 1,600? Is it 1,600 stadia? Do I have the right number? Something like that.
Yeah, I don't think it was 16 stadia. Maybe I don't think it was 1,600. But yeah, it's a smaller number. But yeah, I mean, it's what that means is what they were writing. So yeah, I mean, to back up. So yeah, there was this after the Crusaders got into the city of Jerusalem in 1099 and were able to liberate it from Islamic control. There was obviously killing and rampage and whatnot that happened as part of warfare. I mean, it was standard tactics in medieval warfare, both on the Islamic side and Christian side, that if you went to a city, with an army, you camped outside the city, you demanded its surrender. If the city refused to surrender, and you were able to take the city as the attacker, then once you got into the city, pretty much there were no holds barred. You were able to do whatever you wanted to in the city. And again, there's plenty of examples on both sides to illustrate that was kind of standard practice. So we have to understand it first in the historical context. But to think somehow that the Crusaders went into the city and they killed every single man, woman, and child in the city, as the alleged massacre myth purports, is just not true. That's not what happened. Many people were killed. That is verifiable historical fact. But There wasn't like everybody in the city, number one. Number two, the whole documents, as you mentioned, the contemporary accounts, chronicles that were written by those who were actually on crusade, say that, we came into the city and, there was great destruction and massacre and slaughter and so much so, as you mentioned, that the, blood up to the bridle of our horses or up to our knees in different accounts was the result. And that was obviously not a literal, it should not be taken as a literal amount of blood. I mean,
it would be impossible.
Right. It's physically impossible.
Not even close. It couldn't even be
right.
close to that. Yeah.
Physically impossible to do that. But we in the modern world have a difficult time when we read those kinds of texts, because if from our modern perspective, we're used to CNN or Fox News or somebody being embedded into military units and giving us, a detailed blow by blow, minute by minute kind of account of what happens in the combat situation and in these different wars. But the medieval world, the medieval mind was very different. The medieval mind was very steeped in the faith, very steeped in scripture. And so, a medieval person who hears an account of, our forces got into Jerusalem and there was blood up to the bridle of our horses, they would immediately recognize that that's a reference to the book of Revelation, where God sends forth, the four horsemen of the apocalypse to go and to have judgment on the earth. And there's a reference in the book of Revelation, I think it's chapter 12, where there's blood that rises up to, the bridle of the horsemen's of the horse of the horsemen of the apocalypse. So it's a scriptural reference which really imparts the notion of judgment, that God's judgment. So what that meant for the contemporaries is that when the Crusaders got into Jerusalem, that for them was God's, because they were victorious, that was God's judgment on the forces of Islam. And that's why the Crusaders were able to liberate the city. And that's how a medieval person would understand that.
But there were, how many people do you estimate were killed in that city when we took Jerusalem?
Yeah,
several thousand?
Yeah, several thousand. The best estimate, anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 people.
And the problem is, when you took a city like that, when you're involved in war, you don't have the luxury of having a Gitmo or something like that, a prison, to keep them. If a lot of the times in the Roman times, if you took over an army, they would join your army. But that wasn't going to be the case with Islam, because Islam is all about the jihad. You can't change your allegiance isn't just to a man, but it would be an allegiance to the God that you serve. But then what happened later on when Jerusalem? No, so we didn't come in there to attack Jerusalem. We came to liberate it, and that was the purpose of the Crusades. Is that pilgrimage? People were being killed by robbers, by thieves, and all that land had been taken over. The whole concept of the Muslim world is there's those people that are Muslim and those people that are at war. The two worlds, or how is that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, so the Muslim kind of viewpoint, the worldview that was established by Muhammad is to see the world in two different camps, basically. They call them the Dar al-Islam, or the House of Islam, and then the Dar al-Harb, which is the House of War. So you have, and so basically what that means is that you're either in the House of Islam, you're either a believer of Allah and Muhammad as the prophet, and you're a member of the community of Muslim believers, or you're in this other group called the House of War. And it's the job, or the kind of mission, so to speak, of those in the House of Islam to bring those in the House of War into the House of Islam.
Okay, we got it.
Jihad.
Through jihad, we got to come right back. And the sultans there, they would say, every one of their like sub generals or whatever, they were expected to take over one more nation every during their reign. This is Bear Woznick with the Bear Woznick Adventure. We're talking with Steve Weidenkopf, the church historian. He's a professor at Christendom College. If he's the professor of history there in the graduates program, he's kind of a smart guy. We'll be right back with more of the Bear Woznick Adventure. Aloha and welcome back to the Bear Woznick Adventure. I'm your adventure guide, Bear Woznick. We have our guest today, Steve Weidenkopf. Is it Dr. Steve Weidenkopf, or how are we supposed to call you? Professor? What should we call you?
Just professor. I don't have my doctorate yet.
Okay,
so
we're
God willing one day. But
okay, we'll call you Professor. The professor is in the house. Hey, before we get started with Steve, I just want to remind you guys about the Bears Man Cave. I think it's the Catholic. Oh, by the way, I want to stand up and show you. I'm wearing the Catholic Man Show shirt today. You see that? Those of you that are watching on Facebook, not you that are listening on radio, a shout out to Adam and David over there, the Catholic Man Show over there in Oklahoma. Love those guys. But we have something, they kind of inspired it a little bit for me. We have something called the Bear's Man Cave. And people can go to our website. We simplified it because no one can remember the name of our ministry, Deep Adventure. So it's just bearwoznick.com will take you to our ministry website. And if you're a man, you can click on Join the Man Cave, Bear's Man Cave. We give you access to our private Facebook group. And it's just the coolest thing. Stephen, if you could see it, we got guys there that look like ZZ Top, dude. And we got people from France and the Philippines. We got all kinds of bikers. We got such a mixed bag of misfits, you know. And we will challenge each other, encourage each other. We'll quote John Wayne. We'll quote John Paul II. And every 2 or 3 weeks, we could get together for a video hangout. You know, we call it a meetup, the Bears Man Cave meetup. So if you guys really want to get fired up, go to bearwoznick.com and join the Man Cave. And also there, remember, our ministry is supported by you guys, and to do this radio show, to do the morning catechism, to shoot Long Ride Home reality TV show, it's very expensive, and so we appreciate your donations. And also, you can become a monthly donor. You can also go to our website. We got cool stuff there. My books. We got Bears Man Cave cigars, the 7 Virtue cigar samplers, which we selected ourselves, designed ourselves. Shirts, all kinds of stuff like that. So anything you can do to help us, especially during this Christmas season, remember us. We really would appreciate it. Anyway, so much for the commercial. Stephen, professor, the professor's in the house. Where's Ginger and Marianne? Are they?
yeah, they're upstairs. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Anyways, we got Professor Stephen Weidenkopf. He is the professor for church history in the graduate program at Christendom College. Warren Carroll, the founder, president, is mind-blowing. If you're teaching there, it's amazing because his whole series of books are just incredible on the history of the church. And he's written 2 great books, one on the glory of the Crusades and one about the real history of the real story of Catholic history that just came out. This other one on the Crusades. I've got a lot of people reading your books. So we were talking about, let's take this whole concept, this fake news about jihad. If you are a Muslim, they say they will tolerate non-Muslims to live with them. But what they mean by that is you pay an extra tax. You're probably not going to be able to enter into contracts. You're going to be not able to take most jobs, things like that. Am I wrong about that? What's the nature of this so-called Muslim tolerance to non-Muslims living in their countries?
Yeah, so I mean that's a great question. I mean, when Islam spread forth, from the 7th century out from Arabian Peninsula and then conquered all these ancient Christian territories in North Africa and into what is now the Holy Land, Syria, those areas, they did allow Christians and Jews. They're known in the Quran as people of the book. I mean, they're a protected people as part of the community. However, if they're given the opportunity to convert to Islam, in some cases those were forced conversions, but in most cases, those were not forced. So people of Jews and Christians were allowed to live in these occupied territories, but to do so, you were considered really kind of the lower rung rather of Islamic society. So you were barely above the status of a slave. You weren't able to testify in court, for example, because your testimony was automatically considered to be null and void, to not be truthful because you weren't a Muslim. You had to pay, as you mentioned, the tax, the jizra, every year, which was a very humiliating tax. It was very onerous, and the manner in which you had to pay it was very humiliating. You had to present yourself in front of the Islamic tax collector, who would actually slap you on the face publicly and then demand your money from you in a very violent kind of, again, humiliating way. And there were other restrictions. You couldn't own weapons. You couldn't build new churches or synagogues. They allowed current churches and synagogues to exist, but you couldn't repair them. So it was kind of a gradual conversion, so to speak. It was through these repressive societal structures, as well as again, not being able to build new places and to evangelize, that over time and over the centuries, you had this majority Christian Jewish population that did convert and became Muslim. But at the time of the Crusades, as we were just talking about, when you get to the 11th century, there are still sizable pockets of indigenous Christians and Jews living in the Holy Land in North Africa.
So we were not going to go into too much detail because I want to do something else, go a different direction with your book. But basically, with the Ottoman Empire, you see them coming up towards, from Constantinople, and then all the way through North Africa, up and through Spain into France a little bit. The world was about to become a Muslim world, and to say that the Christians in Europe shouldn't rise up and fight back and besmirch the reputation of these crusaders, who certainly didn't go make a lot of money. They would spend 5 or 6 years of their annual income, the kings and stuff, to go fight, and a lot of them didn't come back, and certainly most of them didn't come back. That's not to say that there weren't some crusaders who broke away from the Pope's instruction and became, like with any, they weren't following what the church asked to do, and they would raid, they would persecute Jews at times up in Germany, right? I think you.
Yep, in the Rhineland, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, there was that, but that was not sanctioned by the church, and the sacking of Constantinople wasn't either. But correct. Now, okay, so now I want to go, boom, let's fast forward. World War II, the whole Nazi thing. What is the fake news about that as far as the Catholic Church goes?
Yeah, well, the biggest one, right, is that Pope Pius XII and the Church didn't do anything to stop the final solution or the Holocaust. Is one kind of fake news element. Another one that you thankfully don't hear too much anymore is that that Pius XII was somehow Hitler's pope, meaning that he was sympathetic to the Nazis, and that's why he didn't speak out about the final solution and these kinds of things. And it's over the last let's say 20 years, 15 years, maybe there's been a significant amount of scholarship on this in this area that has completely refuted this fake news. And to not get into too detail about the Pius XII, but to just kind of talk about it in general, is that all of these myths that I talk about in my book, what I try to do is also point out why these myths exist and why they persist. And it's very true of Pius XII too, in particular, that these myths persist because the people who perpetuate them are those who really have, are enemies of the church.
They have an agenda.
They have an agenda. They don't want to see the church succeed. They don't want the gospel spread. They don't want people growing in a relationship with Christ. Now, that's not to say that every person you run into who mentions these myths has that as their intent, right? Many of these people, are just kind of repeating what they've heard.
It's propaganda. They've been indoctrinated with that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, I know Pope Pius, talk to us about that. I know when he tried to stand up and really make a stand, the German response is, let's just go kill a bunch more Jews. It was like he had to be very dexterous and delicate. How many? Give us the real story. Actually, you've got about 2 minutes to shorten this down for us. Tell us the real story about that.
Yeah, I mean, Pius XII did what he could, and did actually many things for the Jews in the Second World War. I mean, he ordered his nuncios around the world to hide Jews as much as possible, to even issue fake baptismal certificates in certain cases as well, so that in the hopes that they wouldn't be persecuted. And as you briefly mentioned, I mean, he knew in the back of his mind that if he was to speak out forcefully, that could cause more difficulty for the Jews. And he had an exact case of that in Holland, in the Netherlands, where the Dutch bishops spoke out very viciously against Nazi racial policies. And that country alone, there were more Jews that were rounded up and exterminated in Holland than any other Nazi-occupied territory, simply because the bishops spoke out. But all in all, one Jewish historian has estimated that the Pius XII and the Church saved 860,000 Jews, or about 30% of those who survived the Holocaust.
And so how do we get this radically different story? I know the Pope himself, at his summer home, there were thousands of Jews there, I believe, right? And they would and many of the bishops and cardinals, they would house them in their homes. They would hide them at the risk of great harm, we did all that we could for them. My perception is, well, how do we get this false perception?
Yeah, well, I mean, the short answer is that it comes from really the Soviets after the Second World War. They were looking to discredit the church and to discredit, the Western world, obviously, and they began this propaganda campaign to smear the papacy, to smear Pius XII in particular, and therefore to limit the power and authority of the church in the world and its influence, really. So they began it, and then it kind of continued itself and it picked itself up in the 90s with dissident Catholics, we'd call them, people who don't believe in the teachings of the church and want the church to change certain teachings. So they kind of picked up on some of these false propaganda from the Soviets and tried to perpetuate it to, again, get the church to be diminished in the world and to change her teachings.
We're talking with Professor Steve Weidenkopf from Christendom College in Alexandria, Virginia. We'll be right back. We'll talk a little bit more about his new book, The Real Story of Catholic History. Is that what it's called again? What is? I can't read it without my glasses. Okay, this is the Bear Woznick Adventure. We'll be right back. Aloha and welcome back to the Bear Woznick Adventure. We want to welcome everybody that's been watching live on Facebook. And one thing I've neglected to tell you is you can text us through YouTube. If you click on or watching it via YouTube, you can chat with us and give us some questions. Maybe you can give us a real hard one for Professor Steve Weidenkopf, who's our guest. Let's try to stump him, you guys. And then we, but most of you are listening on EWTN radio, Global Catholic Radio, whether it's on the antenna-based radio or the app or Sirius satellite radio, and we also have podcasts, every single podcast app you can listen to it. But best of all, if you go to bearwoznick.com, subscribe to our email, we send you the radio show before it even airs with fully what you're watching on Facebook Live. If you're watching it that way, you're watching like the raw version. But if you go to, if you subscribe, we'll send you out the radio show about a day early, and then you can share it with your friends like it's an MP3 kind of version of the show, and that's a great way to evangelize. So I want you to consider doing that. But we've got Professor Steve Weidenkopf with us, and your website is a cool website. It's ourcatholichistory.com, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and that's a website that has a program that I developed years ago through Ascension Press. It's called EPIC, A Journey Through Church History, and it's an adult.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's an adult faith formation program that covers, in 20 sessions, covers all 2,000 years of church history.
It's video, right?
Yeah, it's video. So there's DVDs that you use along with the study, and there's CD audios that go along with it as well. If people want to just listen to it in the car, kind of thing. And there's a workbook, and the idea is that you gather together in small groups at your parish, or your home, or wherever, and kind of walk through the history of our church. And I take our 2,000 years of church history and break it into 12 time periods to make it but easier for people to digest. And then we just kind of focus on the main events or main people of each of those 12 time periods.
I can dig on that so much because I mean it's a huge undertaking to do something like that. I don't know if people know that, but the idea is, get a group together at your church and view this together and dialogue together. And it's easy to be a host because you basically give them a turnkey type situation. So it's not just reading it. There's going to be dialogue there and sharing about it. So it's pretty cool. So we were talking before we made the break about the whole thing with the fake news that your book debunks. We were talking about Pope Pius and what happened with the Nazis and how the church did everything they possibly could to stand in the breach, and then Russia, trying to influence like they did the elections, right? Or
yes.
They didn't have social media. How many churches were there in Russia before the communist takeover, and how many were left? How many priests? All that. What's the real news about that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think you stumped me there. I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head anymore. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the church actually had made specific inroads, or significant inroads rather, into Russia in terms of its missionary outreach and evangelization efforts. And but as a result of the Second World War, really, as a result of the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, they were very anti-religious, and they basically closed all of the churches, expelled the bishops, persecuted the clergy and Catholics as a whole, especially later on in the 20th century, when you have Stalin and his persecution of people in Ukraine in particular, which was a very Catholic area and Catholic country.
I'm Ukrainian. Yeah.
Oh, are you? Yeah. So
half Ukrainian.
I mean,
yeah.
There's it was a horrible, horrible history of persecution against the people in that area of the world, and so the Russians really were able to kind of put a stop to this great Catholic outreach and missionary activity there. And there's a fantastic priest who Father Walter Chiswick, who in the 20th century, right before the Second World War, or actually right during the beginnings of the Second World War, kind of clandestinely went into Russia to spread the gospel and to minister to people in Russia, was found out that he was a Catholic priest by the communists. They arrested him and sent him off to prison in Lubyanka in Moscow at first, and then he was sent to Siberia for I think 20 years, where he was in a labor camp and did hard labor there. Eventually was brought back to the United States under the Kennedy administration. But his book, or he has several books by Ignatius Press. One is With God in Russia, and the other one is He Leadeth Me. It's just it's a moving and a story of this just brilliant, loving, and just courageous man of God.
Well, I want to say this: people are like embarrassed to be Catholic or apologetic about it. It's time to stand up and like, dudes, I'm Catholic. That means I've embraced truth, reason, and theology, philosophy, theology, the truth of the Catholic Church's moral teaching. I'm not a kind of Catholic, a menu Catholic where I pick and choose. I'm a Catholic, and you should be proud of it. There's no one that stands for truth and justice and love more than a Catholic. And so many in the church today, our beautiful brothers and sisters in the evangelical world and stuff, if you went through and read what they teach, so much stuff that would have been refuted 1,000 years ago is heresy. There's so much spiritual stew out there in Christianity and then in the New Age movement and all that. Stand up and say, I am Catholic. We are the place you go to for truth, reason, and the depth of Catholic, spirituality. To be Catholic, you look at Professor Richard Dawkins and Hitchens and all those. I'm not going to say anything. They think if you're a believer, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
And Bill Maher, loves to talk about more people have been killed by Christians in wars than any other thing. And I know the University of Hawaii about 4 years ago had this study. I don't know if you heard about it, but they said in the history of Christian wars, I think they said about 2 million, maybe less than 2 million were killed in the Crusades or whatever. But Dawkins goes under atheists. Why would they kill anybody just because they're atheists? You look at the communist regimes, the atheistic regimes, the University of Hawaii says over 200 million, and that's just in the last 100 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the myths that I address in the book in particular. This whole, and it's because it's a standard common myth, right, that you hear from people, especially atheists, that religion in general, sometimes they make it specific to Christians or to the Catholic Church in particular, is responsible for more wars and more death than any other in the history of the world. And that's just it's so false, frankly, on its head, to be laughable if it wasn't so widely believed. All you have to do, as you mentioned, is look at the 20th century and look at what the political movements of communism, fascism, and National Socialism brought to the world. Hundreds of millions of people killed in that century alone, in less than 100 years, really, because of these political ideologies, which had nothing to do with the religious faith and had nothing to do with the Catholic Church. Indeed, those political ideologies and movements persecuted the Catholic faith and Catholic Church. All of them did. So that's just another kind of fake news element that's become so widely believed that people just kind of unthinkingly accept it. But you have to, if you're challenged by that, you have to kind of turn that back to the person who brings it to you and say, well, what about what happened in the 20th century? How do we explain that?
Yeah, and we're talking with Professor Steve Weidenkopf, graduate professor of church history, church history at Christendom College. And I just dig on that. I think I got to meet a teacher, or maybe it was one of the dean or someone at the Napa Institute. He goes, I'm from Christendom College. I go, what? I wanted to, bow and genuflect. I'd really dig on that school. I love Warren Carroll. Love his books. They're just so great. And we started off this conversation talking about Cardinal Newman saying that to know history is to cease to be Protestant. Because this morning in my Catholic Catechism, I read the Didache. And you go back through the early church fathers, and you see. What blew my mind is when I read Justin Martyr's statement about the epiclesis. I don't know when that was. It was in the second century.
Early second century. Yeah.
When I read that, Steve, I realized as a kid I heard that at Mass.
Yeah.
The primitive, roaring young lion of the Catholic Church was a Catholic church.
Oh yeah.
And so how can you not embrace that? Give us one more debunking. We got about a minute for you to do it.
Let's talk about briefly just my favorite myth that I wrote into the book or that I wrote about in the book, and that's the myth that Marie Antoinette was a selfish and decadent, Catholic queen who callously told her subjects to eat cake, and that's so false. It's actually the opposite of what she did. In real life, Marie Antoinette was very concerned about the life of her people in France and during their financial crisis and famine, and she actually established soup kitchens and handed out food to the people in Paris so that they could receive food and not starve. And so that whole let them eat cake was propaganda that was created by anti-monarchy forces as well as anti-Catholic forces who were in favor of the revolution to discredit her and to discredit the church. And it's a commonly accepted thing today that's completely false.
The revolution that killed thousands of Catholics and priests, and the whole thing let them eat cake was first brought out in a book that was published before she even came to France, I think. Isn't that right?
Yeah, exactly. And most historians have attributed the quote to Maria Theresa of Spain, who was the first wife of Louis XIV, who died 70 years before Marie Antoinette even lived. So yeah.
You guys, I'm just so upset. We got to go, Steve. So ourcatholichistory.com is where you find Professor Steve Weidenkopf. Okay, and this is Bear Woznick with the Bear Woznick Adventure. Go check out our website, bearwoznick.com, and you can find all kinds of gear there and books and even motorcycle pins and patches from our TV show, The Long Ride Home. Until next week, we look forward to seeing you. This is Bear Woznick. Viva Cristo Rey! Okay, Steve, thanks for